All right. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Super excited today to be with you. My name is Alex Seeskin. I'm the director of the To&Through project. And today's going to be a little bit different for a few important reasons. The first reason is that normally on webinars like this, we sort of do panels or we present original research. Today is a little bit more in some ways of a policy presentation. So I'm going to present a little bit of our data from the To&Through project, but for the most part, I'll be presenting other people's research in order to make an argument about selective enrollment high schools and selective or elite colleges. The other reason that today is a little bit different is because it's not representative of the To&Through project. And so usually when we at the To&Through project do an event like this, we come on and we say, here's our research and sort of here's what we think. And today I'm going to just really be speaking from my personal perspective. And we're trying to do a little bit more of this at To&Through to allow people to come out and say, here's what I think as a person in education, and not necessarily, representing everyone at To&Through. The third thing is we usually do a Q&A afterwards, but because this isn't original research and because you'll be sick of hearing me talk in about 30 minutes, we're gonna not do Q&A today and move right to small group discussions. And so when I finish, my colleague Jessica will put into the chat a link to a Zoom room, and we'll have 30, 40 minutes to be in some small groups and to really debate and discuss some kind of big questions about, like, why do we need selective enrollment high schools? Or what are the purposes of these elite colleges? And to try to grapple with some of those sort of bigger philosophical questions. So I'm really, really excited about that. And I want to encourage everyone to stick around for both the presentation, but then especially for the discussion, so we can be in community and just try to wrestle with some of these kind of really complex questions. So with that, thank you so much for being here today, for joining me here, and let's go ahead and get started. We try here almost always to talk about positionality at the beginning of conversations. Normally, and I would still say today for sure, I bring a host of different perspectives to this topic. As always, I am a white cisgender male, able-bodied. Documentation. I have, come from an upper middle class background. But in particular today, I think it's just important to share just some of the ways in which I've interacted both with selective enrollment high schools here in Chicago and with selective colleges here and around the country. So want to name that I actually started my teaching career at Walter Payton College Prep, coming actually from Northwestern University. So graduated from Northwestern and right away went to Walter Payton and spent 2 years teaching there. Then taught elsewhere in Chicago Public Schools at Lakeview High School, and went to a graduate program at Harvard for a few years, and then came back to Chicago. And for the past 8 years, I've been at the University of Chicago at the To&Through project. And so, when we're talking about, these selective enrollment high schools, elite colleges, many of us have experiences that color the ways in which we, think about and our opinions and our perspectives, and I certainly bring those as well. And so, just want to name those here at the start. The other piece is that this presentation is in many ways sort of pulled together from two op-eds that I've wrote over the past few years. several years ago, I guess it's only about 2 years ago, it looks like. On the right, I wrote a piece about rethinking the selective part of selective enrollment high schools. And last year, I wrote a piece about ending legacy admissions at elite schools like UChicago and Northwestern. And much of today's presentation, though not all, is drawn from those two pieces. And in a follow-up email to today's presentation, we will share with you these links as well as other links that I'll be drawing from today. So I'm going to break the presentation today kind of up into kind of a few different pieces. And I'm going to start with higher education. And start by making the case that, elite colleges are actually places where less advantaged students can move up the income ladder. And this is something that I think maybe, is kind of counterintuitive. We sometimes think of elite colleges as places that are really, really hard for less advantaged students, for first-generation students, for students of color. And that is absolutely 100% true. Most elite colleges are PWIs, they're predominantly white institutions, and they can be really, really challenging and difficult places for students to, particularly first-gen students and students of color to feel like they belong. And what's also true is that once students, first-generation students, as an example, or students from less advantaged backgrounds, when they do graduate, they are able, in many cases, to earn the same amount of money as their peers. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And part of that is shaped by what the reason that I think in many ways I do this work, and many of us do this work in education, which is to try to create a more equitable society. And so much of that equity in some ways is rooted in like this ultimate outcome, which is like who has wealth and power in our society. And I want to show this graph, and there are many others out there about the racial wealth gap, about just the wealth gap, the ways in which middle class are kind of disappearing from the United States. But as you can see here, this blue line here are white people in the United States. And you can see that even going back to like 1963, so really like the sort of heart of the civil rights movement, there was a gap between white people and, in this case, it was being measured, non-white people. But that gap, as some of our society has become more equitable, that gap has grown and grown and grown. As you can see here, even over like the last decade, you can see that this gap between the wealth that white people in our society have and that non-white people have continues to grow, and with that wealth comes power. And changing this racial wealth gap, I think, is part of the reason that I'm involved in education, is to try to rework this, to try to redistribute wealth and power in our society. And the case I'm going to make today is that part of the way to do that, I think, if we are going back here to redistribute this wealth, to try to create more equity in terms of the wealth and power that people have, I think we're going to have to do some of that, not all of that for sure, but some of that through our elite colleges here in Chicago and around the country, and through our selective enrollment high schools. And that's part of the case that I'm going to make. Okay. We're going to start off today with a really, really complicated graph, and I promise you that none of the other graphs that I show today are going to be nearly this complicated. So please don't sign off from this webinar after seeing this graph. But it's an important one. I thought a lot about, should I take it out? Should I not? But I really want to sort of spend some time here, because I think this graph is really important. It comes from some research that was done at Stanford and Harvard, actually, just to name elite institutions, by, in particular, an economist named Raj Chetty. And it was sort of visualized, and much of the data that I'm going to show today was visualized by the New York Times. And so just to walk through this graph, and the way to understand it is that we're going to be looking here at students who were born between 1980 and 1982. This is actually me. I think I'm probably part of the data here. And then roughly graduated from college between 2002 and 2004. And this, the bottom here, the x-axis is students' parents' income. So, where students' parents' income was when they entered college. And then here you can see the student's income, the child's income, once they graduated. I believe it's when they got to like 34, the age of 34 or something along those lines. And so if we pick a point here, right, just to give an example of a point here on this, kind of gray line, you can see here that roughly speaking, this is students who on average were in the, whose parents on average were in, let's say, the 27th or 26th percentile in terms of parent income. And on average, again, this gray line is across the country. It's all children. Students whose parents' income was in the 27th percentile ended up with income at the age of 34 at about the 43rd percentile or somewhere like that. So they sort of moved up a little bit from the 27th to the 43rd. We can take a different point over here. This point would mean, again, for all children, students whose parents' income was in the, let's say, 57th percentile. There, as children, as adults, when they became adults and graduated, or didn't graduate, depending on whether or not they went to college, because this is all children, this would be their income would be in the 54th percentile. So it might go down a little bit. And you can see there's this relationship here for all children between their parents' income and their income once they turn 34. So the higher their parents' income, the higher their income once they turn 34. And in a capitalist country like the United States, that's something that I bet we'd all sort of assume would likely be true. But I want to point out now these other three lines, which I think are really interesting. So you can see here, the yellow line is selective public institutions. That orange line is other elite institutions. And then you've got a reddish line, which is Ivy plus institutions. I'm forgetting exactly what that is. It's likely, the Ivy League plus Stanford and, maybe the University of Chicago. And so what's different about these lines is that it doesn't matter when students go and attend these schools, it doesn't matter as much what students' parents' income was, right? So if you are a student over here, for example, at this dot, your parents' income would be about 20 in the 25th percentile, but your income would be about in the 75th percentile on average if you attended the Ivy League plus. And just to move over, if your parents' income was all the way over here in the 85th percentile, your income as a 34-year-old, again, on average, would only be about 5 percentage points higher in the 80th percentile. And so we can see here what attending these elite colleges does. Again, I'm not making the case that attending elite colleges is a better education, that you get a richer education necessarily. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's a lot of problems with the education. And like I said, with the the culture at these schools. But what these schools, whether or not we sort of like it or not, what these schools do is give students who attend them this, the sort of the network, the cachet that enables them to move up into, or to stay into if their parents' income was high, or to move up if their parents' income was low, into the upper middle class. And so you can see, even again, for students whose parents' income was in the 10th percentile, 20th percentile, 30th percentile, when they attend these institutions, they move dramatically up into, let's say, the 60th, 70th, 75th, 80th percentile in terms of income. And I'm going to argue that that's exactly the type of economic mobility that we need if we want to close the racial wealth gap. We need more and more children whose parents are low income to move and to gain more wealth and higher income as they become adults. Okay. I want to look here, and I'm going to talk throughout this presentation about University of Chicago and Northwestern as examples. I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. One, just because they are, examples of elite selective colleges. But second, because they're local, they're here. In my case, I went to one, attended one, and work at another. And so I have a really close relationship to both of these schools. This here is an example of the type of data that the New York Times gives you access to. And when we send that follow-up email, you can go to the New York Times and you can search for any institution in the country and get this type of really rich data about what types, who's attending the schools, and what types of income people have when they once they graduate. Don't go now, because I want you to keep paying attention to what I say. But afterwards, please check out the New York Times. It's a really, really rich data set. I want to point out here, there's a ton of different data here. But what I want to just show here is that for students, again, who attend the University of Chicago, and again, they use the word poor. We're not going to use that word here, but students from from economically disadvantaged families, when they attend the University of Chicago, end up in the 69th percentile in terms of income, versus students who have economically advantaged parents, or who come from economically advantaged families, end up just in the 73rd. So again, not a ton of difference at the University of Chicago. I know for a fact that students at the University of Chicago, who are low income, who are a first generation, tend to have very, very different experiences than other students. But once they graduate, their incomes again look really, really similar. And Northwestern is going to look almost identical. Again, students from economically disadvantaged families in the 70th percentile, and students from economically advantaged families only 6th percentile higher. So again, Northwestern and the University of Chicago, like a ton of elite institutions, do a lot wrong. But one of the things that, again, whether it's do right or just part of the sort of capitalist environment in the United States, students who attend those schools end up being relatively wealthy. So just want to summarize this sort of like first point here, which is, first of all, graduates of elite colleges in the United States make a lot of money. And graduates earn that money regardless of their parents' wealth. And this creates an opportunity, a really rich opportunity for income mobility, and potentially for the closing of the racial wealth gap. And I want to highlight, as you can see here from the italics, I want to highlight that word opportunity. It's an opportunity that I'm going to argue we are not taking advantage of nearly enough. And so this is the sort of second point that I'm going to make, which is that although elite colleges have the greatest opportunity to create economic mobility, They rarely admit poor students. And so this is another, somewhat complicated graph, but I want to spend some time here because it's really, really important. The headline here says it all. So there are more students from the top 1% at elite colleges than there are students in the bottom 40%. And you can see here, this is sort of all, I believe this is all Ivy, this is the elite colleges. So it's roughly 80 of the most selective colleges in the United States. And we can see here, the bottom 10% in terms of income, in terms of family income, make up about 2% of the student population at those schools. So again, the bottom 10% make up only about 2% of the student population at those schools. And you can see that hasn't changed at all, recently. The bottom 20% make up maybe 4%, maybe a little bit less. The bottom 40% make up maybe about 9%-ish at those schools. But then look at the top 1%. The top 1% make up more than the bottom 40% in terms of parent income. And so although these colleges have tons of opportunity to create economic mobility, the problem is that the most common student that they're admitting is from the top 1%. And the top 1% in terms of students that they're admitting and who are enrolling there are higher than or more of those students than at the bottom 40% in terms of parent income. And I want to just point out again here the University of Chicago and Northwestern. So at the University of Chicago, there are about twice as many students from the top 1% as there are in the bottom 20%. And the University of Chicago actually, among its Ivy League sort of plus peers, is actually doing reasonably well, which this shows you in terms of admitting students from, lower income students. But still, we're talking about the comparison here between 5.5% of the student body from the bottom 20% versus 10% of the student body from the top 1% of parent income. And if we go to Northwestern, it's actually much worse. Northwestern is not doing nearly as well. At Northwestern, you've got about 4%, a little less than 4% from the bottom 20%, and 14% from the top 1%. And so at Northwestern, it's, whether it's 3 times, 4 times, almost 4 times as many students from the top 1% as the bottom 20% of parent income. So in summary here, just to pause, so despite the success in many, again, the economic success, I want to emphasize, that low-income students have when they attend elite colleges, very, very few are actually admitted and actually enroll. And this represents a real missed opportunity to create a more equitable distribution of wealth in our society. I'm making the case here that if our elite institutions looked like the rest of our society, in terms of race, in terms of income, in terms of documentation, in terms of a whole bunch of different pieces, if elite institutions looked the way the rest of our society looked, then we'd be able to get further, not all the way for sure, but we would move, take a step towards closing many of those income gaps. I want to pivot now to talk a little bit about selective high schools and the role that selective high schools play here, because I think there's a connection, and that's the case I'm going to make, between selective high schools and elite colleges. And part of who gets into elite colleges in Chicago depends on who gets in to selective high schools. And so there's a clear pathway here in our city from selective enrollment high schools to elite colleges. On our the To&Through milestones tool, and again, we'll include a link to that, and specifically to this page, you'll be able to sort of see this data, and we list out all of the different colleges that CPS students attend, and we list the number of enrollees there over a 3-year period. So this 104 means that over the last 3 years, about 104 students from Chicago Public Schools have enrolled at the University of Chicago. This means essentially on average, there are about 35 or so CPS graduates who enroll at the University of Chicago each year. I think that's lower than many people think, and it's lower certainly than I would like my university, the university I work at, to me, we are the University of Chicago, we should have a ton, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of CPS students who are enrolling every year from our city. If you click here on the right on the page, you get to a view that looks like this. And I think this is really important because what this shows is which high schools those 104 students are coming from. And we list out all of the high schools until we get to high school, a high school with less than 5. And once we get to 5, we don't show it to protect students' anonymity. And so you can see here that the top 3, in fact, the only high schools with more than 5 students over a 3-year period who are going to the University of Chicago from CPS are selective enrollment high schools, namely Whitney Young, Northside, and Jones. We can look at Northwestern, and I want to note here just how different Northwestern looks in one really important way, which is whereas the University of Chicago was at 104 students or enrollees from Chicago Public Schools over the course of the last 3 years, Northwestern is at 366. It's worth noting here some of these other colleges, like there are more students now from CPS enrolling at Northwestern than there are enrolling at Olive Harvey. More students enrolling from CPS at Northwestern than there are enrolling at Chicago State. Northwestern is really has become over the last 6-7 years, like a pretty significant feeder school. There are more than 120 graduates, CPS graduates, enrolling in Northwestern each year, and that's really, really exciting. And I would hope that the University of Chicago sees this and says, we want to do this too. And if we look at which schools are part of that 366, we see a very similar pattern. So over the course of 3 years, about 56 students from Peyton have gone to Northwestern, 54 from Northside, 50 from Lane, 47 from Whitney Young, 27 from Jones. And so you can see a big portion of the students that Northwestern is taking from CPS are going there from selective enrollment institutions. And part of that means that we need to pressure institutions like Northwestern, like the University of Chicago, to accept, to recruit students from outside of selective enrollment high schools, or certainly outside of these 5 selective enrollment high schools. There are other selective enrollment high schools, tons of neighborhood schools, charter schools, all of those things that have amazing, brilliant students that are absolutely 100% capable of doing the work and succeeding at Northwestern and at the University of Chicago. And it also means we need to think about who's getting into Peyton and who's getting into Northside and Lane and Whitney and Jones, because these are the students that are going to have access to that economic mobility, the potential for that economic mobility that I mentioned earlier. And when we look at who has access to these selective enrollment schools, who's getting in, we see something that, not quite as what we saw with elite institutions, but still not as equitable as we would want it to be. When, as part of the selective enrollment process, CPS divides students into 4 economic tiers based on their address and where their address shows up in the census, and sort of the incomes, rough incomes of the people who live around them. And this, just so people know, like, this process of breaking students up into these tiers is one that is pointed to around the country as a really, really equitable system. So I just want to name that, like, CPS in many ways is sort of like ahead of the curve here in terms of how they admit students to selective enrollment schools, because they're thinking about things like income. I should also note that CPS is not allowed to think about race as part of this application process, to explicitly think about race. That is the Supreme Court made that decision, I forget, 7, 8 years ago, something like that. They are not allowed to. And so these tiers are, in one way, I think, sort of a proxy, one of the proxies that CPS uses for race. If you look at these tiers, tier 1 are the sort of a quartile of people or of students in the city with who have families with that have lower incomes, and tier 4 on the other end are students who have families with higher incomes in the top 25 percentile in terms of income. And we can see here this 29%. So if we look at tier 4, about 29 or 30% of students in that top income bracket in the city attend selective enrollment institutions. If you compare that, for example, to the sort of bottom 2 groups, those 2 groups are at about 11%, 12%, 13%. And so despite what I think is really like in many ways like a forward-looking attempt at equity, CPS's system still has problems. The biggest problem is that currently CPS reserves about 30%, or exactly 30% of seats for the top test scorer and GPA students from across the city. And those students disproportionately tend to come from this tier 4 group, this higher income group. I mentioned earlier that those income groups can be a proxy for race. And we can see here that white students are much more likely in CPS to attend selective enrollment schools than, in particular, Latino students and Black students. And so really, really important to note that this system still has real equity issues. So I want to just summarize this portion as well, which is to say CPS students who attend elite colleges primarily come from selective high schools, not always, but are much more likely to come from selective enrollment high schools. Students who attend selective enrollment high schools are disproportionately white and wealthy. And the result is that the students with access to the elite institutions that create wealth are students who already have wealth and power in our city. So where do we go from here? And I want to just kind of make some, kind of high level suggestions about some ways to really change this system. And everything from, I think very sort of, reasonable, sensible ways to make some changes to ways that are much more radical. And I think it's important that we kind of look at all of those. Oops. So one thing to note is that colleges currently are in the midst of a little bit of an upheaval. You've got many colleges that are moving, that have moved to test optional over the last few years as a result of the pandemic. And you have what is likely to be a Supreme Court decision that I disagree with, but that is very likely, I think, to happen in the spring, which will not allow private and public colleges to take race consciously into account during the admissions process. And all of these changes are really shaking things up. And so I think there is an opportunity for elite colleges to make some shifts in the way that they accept students. And so the first push that I'm going to make, and I mentioned earlier that this is connected to an op-ed I wrote in the Tribune last year, is to eliminate legacy admissions. And I should note, I didn't note this earlier, but I am a legacy admit. My mother and father both went to Northwestern, and I was accepted to Northwestern, I think not in large part, but one of the reasons was, I think, because I had that advantage that was unearned, and that I certainly didn't deserve. And so want to note here and show this graph, which comes from some data that Harvard was forced to release as part of that lawsuit that I mentioned that just went in front of the Supreme Court. There's some irony here. Harvard, as part of that lawsuit, had to release all of their data around who they admit and how they go about sort of deciding who to admit and who not to admit. And one of the things we saw as part of that is that white students were much more likely to be legacy admits. White students were much more likely to get a legacy advantage than were other students, which in many ways makes sense because white students for hundreds and hundreds of years have been a significant majority of Harvard's population. And so legacy rewards that inequity in many ways. And so you can see 30% of white students at Harvard were legacies. And you can see the comparison there. So I think one relatively easy way to start would be to eliminate legacy admissions. It's something that's been done, I should name it, Johns Hopkins, at Amherst, at MIT, and at several other schools around the country. Northwestern, University of Chicago, Harvard, and others still use legacy advantage as part of their admissions process. The second thing is not something that I think we don't kind of think about or expect, which is to eliminate the athlete preference. We know that athletes, when a college like Harvard, University of Chicago, Northwestern is recruiting an athlete, oftentimes those athletes receive preferences in terms of their admissions. What we oftentimes don't know is that those athletes, particularly at these elite institutions, are much more likely to be white. I think we think sometimes about the basketball team, the football team, but if you think about all of the other sports, the volleyball team, the tennis team, the golf team, white students, for example, at Harvard, about 16% of white students received an advantage because they were athletes at Harvard, as compared to the advantages here, as you can see, for other groups of students. And so part of creating a more equitable admissions process, part of redistributing wealth and the opportunity to earn wealth at these institutions, I think we need to take a really hard look at athletes and athlete preferences. Those first two are in some ways are like, relatively, again, they're not easy, but like, I think both of them would are things that certainly could happen, particularly eliminating legacy admissions, which I actually think would be relatively easy. The third one, though, I want to put out because I think it is a little bit more radical, and it's something that I think I believe in, which is that these elite institutions likely won't be able to look at race consciously as part of their admissions come the spring. I think they should be able to, but it's likely that they won't. But they can very much look at family income. And going back to CPS's system, and whether it's breaking students down into quartiles or whether it's breaking students down into quintiles or whatever it is, to say we're going to create, we're going to accept equal percentages of students from different economic tiers. The University of Chicago will accept the same percentage of students from the bottom 25% of parent income as we will the top 25% of parent income. And we're going to stick to that. And that's what we are going to do. And I really think that like, if we are about equity at the University of Chicago, that's where we want to get to. That's where we need to get to. Working in Chicago public schools for 10 years, I know that there are so many students that could be so successful, would be successful at the University of Chicago from those lower income groups. I also want to name, when we talk about selective enrollment, that this is something that is very live right now and that CPS is considering and is talking about. And specifically, CPS announced in March that they are going to move forward with configuring their selective enrollment process. I believe it's going to be for next school year. They actually have on their website a way that you can sign in and sort of vote and give them feedback on which of two different options they are going to move forward with. And those options include two different options, both of which I like. I like one more than two. One is to remove the 30%, that sort of top 30% rank across the city, and distribute all seats equally among the 4 tiers, with each tier getting 25% of seats. And this is essentially what I was suggesting for that elite colleges do. I really like option one. I think option one is a reasonable direction to go in. We could also go, though, with option two, which I think is also reasonable, which is to keep the 30% rank across the top, but to weight the remaining 70% of seats so that tiers 1 and 2 receive more than tiers 3 and 4, to sort of make up for the ways in which they are not as much part of that 30% as tiers 3 and 4 are. I also want to put out a third option, which I think I sort of wish CPS had included in here, because I think it's important for us to discuss, which is to say, should we turn Chicago selective enrollment high schools into citywide magnet schools that maybe had like a fairly minimal academic requirement? Maybe it's like a 2.5 GPA and 92% attendance or something like that. Or maybe we're just lottery, almost like charters. In that sense, they were just citywide magnet schools, and I think that there's a really good case to make in a city like Chicago that is so segregated, and where oftentimes neighborhood high schools are segregated themselves. That we should have options that are citywide, that bring students together from across the city. But maybe we shouldn't have those schools be solely based on taking, the top academic achieving students, but just all students from sort of across the academic and other spectrums. So I want to put that third option there as well. All right, I'm going to sort of pause there, and I'm really, really grateful for all of you for joining today. Please don't leave yet. My colleague Jessica is going to put into the chat right now a link to a post-event Zoom discussion. We really want you to move over to that Zoom discussion and not do Q&A and talk with us in small groups about 3 questions. One is, what are your experiences, if any, with selective high schools and colleges? 2, do we need selective high schools and colleges? What purpose do they serve and for whom? And then 3, what are equitable ways to distribute access to these schools? So please join me in this post-event discussion. Go ahead and click on that Zoom link. And I'm excited to see as many of you as possible over in that Zoom, so we can really wrestle in some small groups with some of these really complicated questions about equity and access. Thank you so much for joining me today, and look forward to more conversations and to a post-event email that you should receive soon.